Being back with you guys and getting a chance to share in this series that we've been going through the last few weeks. Now, I know a lot of times as we talk about this, we'll say this story, and so a lot of times we forget that these accounts are actual historic accounts. So many times people say, you know, these characters in the story in the Bible and this, that, and the other, and so we kind of maybe subconsciously put it into this little box of a fictional thing or something like that. But the truth is this: these are historical facts. These are things that happened in history. In fact, we have access to some of the coolest things, because if you go to the British Museum, there's actually a book that they've got there that talks about the Bible in the British Museum, and you can go around and see things that are coming exactly from the time. So like if you talk about the Persian Empire, you can see what was being used or from that time, and it's a great way to be able to connect the two. Now, I have no affiliation with the British Museum, so I'm not trying to raise their profits, because it's free to get in, remember that. But it's just cool for me, because as a former history teacher, I love seeing the stuff that it connects to. I love seeing the fact that this account of Xerxes was real, and how Esther interacted, and how God put her in the perfect place at the perfect time. And if we were looking at this from a story point of view, then the story should have finished last week, right? When Chris finished up chapter 7, you know, Haman, the archenemy, is now gone. He's impaled on the pole that he had put up for Mordecai, and so that should be the end of the story. But the fact is, in the Persian Empire, during the time of Xerxes, you couldn't just cancel a law. So we have to see what the conclusion is, right? We have to see how this is all going to come to a close. Now, I want you guys to remember this. If we could sum up anything from the book of Esther, it's that phrase that Mordecai tells Esther, and that's "for such a time as this." Because when we look at the book of Esther, we see how God has put things in place and put people in the perfect place for such a time as this. And so as we look at this next part of the chapter 8, as it begins, we see what's happened just after Haman's been taken care of, but we come to the realization that everyone is not safe yet. Everyone has not been taken care of yet. Esther is safe, Mordecai is safe, but neither one of them was satisfied with just their own safety. They knew that it had to go a step further. There was more to be done. So when we look at chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "That same day Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate." So if we look at this, we see first off that Esther and Mordecai are completely fine. There is nothing as far as them that there's a problem for them. In fact, if this was one of those stories that's written, you see all the stuff that had belonged to the bad guy now is given to the good guy. So we're like, okay, that's great. But it's not done. And the cool thing that we see is that Esther was in the perfect place to get the king to come to the realization that Haman had tried to kill the Jews for greed and power and this desire of anger that he had. And yet now Mordecai has that same signet ring that has been removed from Haman's finger and given to Mordecai. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because that signet ring is everything. That signet ring exemplifies or personifies the power of the king on Mordecai's hand. Has anybody ever seen those old films where you see them, they'll get a candle, they get the wax hot, they drip it, and all of a sudden they do what? They press a seal over it. Well, that signet ring is exactly for that. Okay? And so drop some wax, and then as soon as you press that down, that is the edict that has no one else authority other than the king's. So from that point on, everything is in law. And Mordecai now has that on his finger. He's safe. He's good. So is Esther. But yet, it wasn't enough for them to be safe. They wanted to make sure that their people were safe as well. So if we look at verse 3, it says, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. Now, there's some clues here. It's not spelled out as it was earlier in the book of Esther when she came to him without permission, without being invited, and that golden scepter was the permission for her to be there and not have to be taken out to be executed. But she's doing it again. She's risking her life again even after she's safe. She's safe, but yet her people were not. So she goes to the king again, crying and weeping. Now, if she's safe, why is she crying and weeping? Because her people were not. Her people were not safe. Her people were not okay. But yet King Xerxes puts the scepter down to once again show her she is safe. She doesn't have to be taken out and put to death because she came before the king without permission. And Esther risks her life to intercede for the Jewish people. Now, intercession, that's one of those Bible words that we don't usually hear in a lot of our culture and time today, do we? Anybody ever heard the term intercession in the last week used in a conversation? No, it's not one of those things that we do. And basically, so we need to make sure we know what it means. And it's when someone who is placed in a place to kind of bridge the gap between two groups of people, usually one with power and one without. And we see this example several times in the Old Testament. We have Abraham. Abraham interceded and went before God and prayed to the Lord to try to save the people of Sodom. And he begged him, Lord, even if you could just find one righteous person, just one, don't destroy the city. We see Moses, after the children of Israel were going on their journey to the promised land, how they time and time and time again sinned against God. And finally God says, you know what, that's it. I'm going to wipe them all out. Moses, I'll start over with you and your family. And Moses says, Lord, please do not let your wrath fall on them. He's like, please don't go with the feelings. And God shows grace for the sake of Moses. Now we have Esther, who's interceding for her people because they are still under threat of death. But all of these intercessions only point to one place, an example, and that is Jesus, who will intercede for us. When it comes to him coming as a baby, that in a few weeks, we're going to start having our Christmas services and stuff like that, and we will hear about the Christmas story and how Jesus came for a purpose. But then we fast forward to Easter, and we see what that purpose was, that he would live a perfect life, die on a cross, then rise again. And it's through that we can have salvation. And it says that he intercedes for us at the right hand of God. So all of these people who are interceding are pointing forward to who Jesus is and what he was going to do ultimately once and for all. But now in this intercession, Esther is pleading because she knows that in the Persian Empire, once a law goes out, that law cannot be canceled or reversed. Because that law is looked upon as representative of the king, who is considered infallible. If you could cancel a law, that means the king messed up. Well, the king can't mess up. He's perfect. Anybody have a problem believing there's perfect people in the world? Yeah. I've never met one. Never seen one in the mirror. But understand, in this time period, that's what their thinking was. So now, as she goes to intercede for us once again, or intercede for them once again, she goes in front of him and says this, if it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman had attacked the Jews, I have given him his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on a pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So once again, we see God's hand in the situation. God has placed Esther and Mordecai in the only place with the power to save his people. Why? For such a time as this. God had given them favor with the king. And the king had placed his signet ring on Mordecai's finger, representing him as the second in command over the entire empire. The only person who was above Mordecai was Xerxes. And Xerxes is saying, look, I'm giving you permission to do this next thing to kind of counteract Haman's thing. But Mordecai knew who the real one in charge was, who the one with real power was. It wasn't Xerxes, it was God. Because God had placed him in that position, along with Esther, for such a time as this. There's too many things for someone to go, well, that's a great coincidence. There had to be someone at work. And God, even though he is not named in the book of Esther, we see God moving parts and pieces in the only way that could be able to save his people when the time was needed. Now, that ultimate symbol of power that's on Mordecai's finger was an earthly thing, but God had put him there for that reason. So that when he pressed that ring down on that wax, everyone would know that the orders had absolute power in this empire. Now, if we read through everything, it would show us that these instructions, this new law, went out in the exact same way that they had under Haman. Except Haman sent out these instructions with greed in mind, with pride in mind, with this lust for power in mind. Whereas these instructions from Mordecai come out with the power to save an entire group of people. And so they send them out on the fastest horses. These horses were literally bred to be the fastest messenger horses in the empire. And so that way the news would get out to everyone. They had the scribes write in every language of the empire. That way there was no way for the instructions to fall through the cracks. They wanted to make sure everybody knew exactly what this decree was all about, with the full authority of the king. Now, it didn't cancel the previous law, because that's not possible, right? But what it did was it officially gave them, the Jews, the right to defend themselves against any attack. And without penalty of a crime or anything else like that, because they had the right to do it. Now, it also allowed them to take possession of any property of those who attack them. And it's meant to happen all on the same day as the previous law. Now, we'll see that the Jews end up not taking any of the possessions, and we'll get to that again later. But what we see is that God delivers this power of victory, their rescue from destruction, months before it was even needed. Kind of reminds me of the fact that God had given the solution through his son Jesus before I even knew there was a question. And when you look at these things and how God does these things, it's always so cool to see his hand at work. Now, when these instructions go out, when these laws go out, we see a response that is best described through Psalm 30, verse 11. It says, "You turn my lament into dancing. You remove my sackcloth and clothe me with gladness." And if we remember, when the first law went out, the clothes that Mordecai wore was sackcloth. It was meant to show a visible sense of mourning for what was happening inwardly. Okay, and because of that, he wasn't allowed in the presence of the king. He wasn't even allowed to cross the threshold of the palace. He had to stay outside because you weren't allowed to dress like that in mourning and be in the king's palace. But now as this decree goes out, the response all across the empire is one of celebration, is one of joy. Completely the opposite reaction from the previous law. Where the previous law was meant to take life, this law was meant to save it. Because remember, the people who Mordecai wanted to give permission to kill the Jews didn't have to follow it. They didn't have to take up arms against the Jews. They would choose to. And now all of a sudden they know that this defense can happen. They can choose to walk away from it. But we'll see that some still do not do that. Now here's some of the cool part. Starting in verse 15 of chapter 8, it says, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing his royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration for the Jews. It was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because of their fear of the Jews had seized them. Now, did you catch that? Different people from around the empire began to follow God because of the salvation they saw with the Jews. And you sit there and go, wait a minute, Haman wanted to destroy all the Jews, right? But instead, Haman is hanging on a pole, and the number of people following God is now multiplied. So he wanted to destroy them, wipe them out completely, yet their numbers have grown. You're going to tell me God didn't work this out perfectly? They could see God's hand of favor on the Jews, and therefore they wanted to follow the one true God. Now understand this. This goes back to Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham had been told by God, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So different people from different nationalities in the empire are now receiving the blessing of God because the Jews that are there, and they can see God at work in them. God is faithful to complete the promises that he made. Even though this promise to Abraham is hundreds of years before, we see this beginning to take place. Now, it's not the ultimate blessing that God is talking about here, because that ultimate blessing is Jesus. But Jesus, how is he going to come if the Jewish people were completely wiped out, if they were supposed to come through the line of the tribes of Benjamin, which is part of the Jews that are there in captivity? If they had been wiped out, how would Jesus come? And yet we see God's hand of protection. That way his promises can be completed. And on that journey to that point, you have people being blessed because of the Jewish nation, because of who God is, because of what he does. So now between this second decree that Mordecai and Esther have sent out and the day of what was supposed to be destruction for the Jews, there's 9 months. 9 months for people to change their mind. 9 months for people to take stock because they had heard and knew exactly what had happened to Haman. They also knew that the law that Mordecai had sent out had given permission for the Jews to defend themselves. They didn't have to do anything. Yet you see the anger and the desire for some people. We're in chapter 9. It says, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all other nationalities were afraid of them. So we went from this rescue being decreed to now all of a sudden this rescue being accomplished. Because as that day comes, they are able to defend themselves. And if we read the whole chapter, you'll see how many people lost their lives and how many people were still determined to go against the Jews and trying to wipe them out. But yet, they were given a complete and total victory. Now understand this. This has nothing to do with the virtuosity of the Jewish people. It had to do with the grace and mercy of God. It was about him. He was the one that was showing his control. He was the one going, I'm the one that's moving the pieces here, not you. And why is that so important? Because we still see that grace even today. We still see that grace in the gift of Jesus. Now, When we look at this section through our modern society eyes and everything, it might be hard for us to kind of understand everything about it. But the truth is this: God's people were delivered. People were added to the